Partha, hello. We've just heard about the nature crisis being a global challenge and that tackling the twin threats of biodiversity loss and climate change requires to invest more in nature. Partha, you were commissioned by the UK's Treasury to review the economics of biodiversity loss, a huge subject. And may I say, it's been a privilege and a pleasure to be working on that review with you. It really has.
Thank you.
But as your review's interim report made clear back in April, you framed the current nature crisis as an asset management problem. Could you unpack that for us a bit and explain how the concept of nature as a financial asset fits into traditional economic thinking?
Thank you very much. Yes, it's. I think the best thing to do is to start by asking what we might mean by asset management. And one usually thinks of it as a financier moving vast sums of money around. But I'm thinking of assets here, the review thinks of assets here as, and its correct way to do it, it is real goods and services, goods in particular. An asset is a durable good, okay, in contrast to a service. And of course, the asset offers services. And for that point of view, we are all asset managers, every one of us, whether you're a farmer, fisherman, whether you're in Niger or whether you're in China, whether you're in India, United States, UK, doesn't matter. Every householder is an asset manager. And we might think of classifying assets, and that's a correct way to do things, thinking of produced capital assets, roads, buildings, human capital, education, health. These are conventional terms now. Even human capital is conventional. But then there is nature, and we now call it natural capital, to bring it in proximity to the others. I mean ecosystems, generally speaking, could be mangroves, could be wetlands. These are real goods, durable goods, which can be tarnished. And we aspire to manage these portfolios of assets, whether it's the farmer or the fisherman, as best as they can under the circumstances, given the constraints they face, the scarcity values they observe for them. Now, humanity globally is failing to manage its global portfolio of assets efficiently. We are continually depleting our natural capital, ecosystems like estuaries, forests, and mangroves, in some cases to the point of collapse. And it is important to recognize that it's not about the future only. Poor people in the poorest of countries have observed their own local assets collapse. So we're not talking about unexplained phenomena or anticipated phenomena only. And biodiversity, the subject of my review, is a characteristic of portfolios, of ecosystems. They make ecosystems productive and resilient. Estimates show that between 1994 and 2014, to give you just an example of how we have tarnished nature, that period produced capital per head globally doubled, and human capital per head increased by about 13%. This is all in real terms, okay? But the value of stock of natural capital per head declined by 40%. That's a huge disparity between the directions of movement of the three categories of assets. A world with a healthy biosphere could choose to draw down its natural capital and use ecosystem services to accumulate produced capital and human capital. That's a plausible scenario. And that is what economic development has come to mean among most economists. But that view and the practices it encourages has meant that in recent decades, humanity's demands have come to vastly outstrip nature's supply. It is the definition of unsustainable behavior.
So certainly this language resonates very strongly with the financial community, Partha. As you of course will realize, we're used to thinking in terms of assets and of risk and of commercial opportunity that arises from those risks, and of course the downside that can come too. Clearly the thinking that you're bringing in here and the thinking that is developing around natural world, natural capital, it has, dare I say it, almost revolutionary consequences for much of the world, because these factors have not been included in the discussion before, and because it so clearly implies that one of the problems to be overcome is also a lack of investment, both a lack of regard for the value of that asset, but also a lack of investment. And of course, finance is perfectly placed to help with that, if we can understand, if we can assess, and if we can manage those risks. And because the mismanagement of asset portfolios also implies opening ourselves up to risk, and those risks become material in several different ways for the finance sector through all the different product areas that we're dealing with. As the review demonstrates, and as we've heard about earlier from Helen Avery's panel discussion with regards to initiatives like TNFD. So in a way, one of the central problems is that nature's worth to society, or the value, the financial value of our natural assets, it's not reflected in market prices. It's not reflected in market thinking either. And I think maybe the thinking needs to come before the prices, but can you explain or help us to understand why this is and how we might particularly affect market thinking around the value of the assets that we're dealing with?
Thank you very much. These are, of course, exactly, your observations are totally in line with the line we are taking in the review. There are three features of nature that make nature a very problematic asset in terms of economic thinking. One is that nature is always on the move. It's not like a building. You own a building, it stays put. But the wind blows, the rivers flow, oceans circulate, even continents drift. But of course, the time that it takes to drift is very slow, but it has powerful influence over time. So that's one, movement, and that makes property rights very hard to define, let alone enforce on those goods. Now, by property rights, I don't mean necessarily private rights, by the way. Could be community rights, could be state rights. A second feature of nature is that it's silent. Many of the processes are silent. What happens beneath our feet, you don't hear. And yet it's doing an enormous amount of work, which we enjoy the benefits from. A third is that it's invisible. Again, what happens in the soils, you don't observe, but the enormous amount of work is going on. It's like a factory churning out services for us. These three characteristics makes institutions, it makes it very hard for institutions. And it's not just markets. Even the state has difficulty coming to terms with natural capital. As a result, market prices certainly are zero. They're free goods for many, many of the services that we enjoy. I mean, regulating services. I mean, carbon sequestration, decomposition. These are incredible services that we enjoy silently, invisibly, and we don't have to pay for it. In fact, the irony is that governments subsidize the use of nature in a big way. And of course, that means we're paying a negative price. We're being paid to exploit nature. So we should recognize that there's an undervaluation of nature. And I should say it's not just the market's fault. States are also at fault. The only institution I know of which broadly speaking recognizes the value of nature are communities, small communities, which live on their local resource base because they can observe what's happening. And if communities have power to adjudicate the use of their local resource bases, threshing grounds, local forest, woodlands, water holes, then they do manage it. We've got lots of evidence of that from anthropologists' work in third world countries. But on the whole, we're rapacious in our use of nature because it comes for free.
Yes, that sounds familiar. The history of capitalism is one of excellent growth and reduction of poverty. It is also a history of exploitation in one form or another, as we are constantly reminded. And I really wonder what future generations will say about our use of natural resources as effectively a free asset. But it's for me, Partha, as a financier, I like to point out that actually financial services are a service. They're not the They're neither the prime mover in the very beginning, and they're very often not the final the solution either. But the services that we can provide love this language, and I think there's a huge willingness that I hear amongst investors and bankers to address this and to find the right solutions. I also hear a lot from companies, our major food companies, our major utilities, our major traders of commodities, that want to get this right. But it has to be a global discussion, not a one-off, because as exactly as you say, individual governments need to be speaking the same language and not come from a different angle, because it immediately skews the competitive situation. So in that respect, this is a much more complicated discussion than climate. Climate, in a way, we focus on a single metric around carbon, and this, the energy revolution that is now happening in renewables is fantastic. We want to get to a similar situation with land deforestation, with land degradation, with the oceans and the like. Therefore, the language here about putting a value and putting a financial price on the resources that we're using, complex though it is, I'm absolutely certain it's the way forward. As your review says, one of the conclusions is that we are mismanaging our asset portfolios, and I wonder if we could move on to talking about how we find solutions to that. What are the ways in which academe and your study and the sense that the financial community are basically on side to find a solution? How can we work together with those to find, as we've just been discussing in the panel and before, the real solutions to valuing these assets correctly?
Well, it has to happen at various layers, and it has to happen in different various ways. First and foremost, we need to have something like a common grammar for understanding our place in nature. The fact that so much of nature is silent, invisible, and travels, and is, as a result, free, has made us think that there is no bounds on nature. We may recognize that the biosphere is finite, but we pride ourselves in our ingenuity to overcome that boundedness. We feel it's almost like a fisherman who goes fishing and knows he can take the fish away, home, cook it, eat it, dump it somewhere, and then comes back next day to fish some more. We are not external to the biosphere. We're embedded in it. We are part of the biosphere. And that perception, that idea that this is our home, will be the first step towards any change. Secondly, of course, you're quite right. I've been speaking with financiers, and particularly your own influence on the review has been enormous. I don't know if you have recognized that, because I think we think alike on these matters. And of course, you have right to be fearful of the future. You have right to worry whether your supply chain is going to come crashing down because an entire ecosystem 5,000 miles away collapses. You need to have, if you're a financier here, you need to have some notion of what the state of the ecosystems there is out there. The problem is, again, as I say, prices are not forthcoming. On the other hand, there are ways of managing assets without having to think about explicit prices. The quality management. You want to ensure that the biosphere is not hurt unduly by the transactions that you're taking, because at the end of the day, it poses risks to you if you don't care about how your activities are, how your portfolio is affecting the activities, portfolio choice. I think we need a combination of a cooperation between financiers, governments, and of course local communities, because that's so much of the economies of the first world, if you like, the rich countries, are built on the primary products of the poor world. And there needs to be a genuine cooperation with governments there, communities there, to ensure that the processes are not treating nature there as valueless. Okay. A third route But there are many ways of attacking this problem. They have all to be done simultaneously. We need to describe our economies in the right way. We think of economic progress as income increases, but income is a flow. And when we look at income, say GDP, we look at the gross income. We don't look at net income. We don't take into account the fact that in raising income, you may be depreciating the assets on the basis of which your income is generated. So even if your GDP, a country's GDP increases, it could imply a sinking floor on which you're operating if you run down your assets. So we need to change the accounting system and move more towards company accounts. I mean, balance sheets. National accounts are not balance sheets. They're about income flows, income and expenditure flows. And of course, that hides a lot of stuff that's going on in the economy's transactions. So you have to worry about that. We have to bring these things together. A final point about, in the response to you, is that investing in nature, it's important to recognize that investing in nature can mean doing nothing. We're not to interpret investment invariably as people, workers with hard hats, digging holes on the ground to lay tarmac. Planting a seed and leaving it alone with a little bit of nurturing maybe, but the nurturing part is minimal. It's the waiting part which is costly. So investment here, metaphorically would be wait, do not harm. Leaving alone a woodland is investing in that woodland because it'll do better next year. That's extremely important. And the value of that increase should be captured in your profitability calculations. And you need to be able to do that. If there were ideal prices, of course, it'll figure in. But even if there are no ideal prices on offer, the agreement between government, civil society, business, communities would ensure that that is protected. And we do that in various bits and pieces. We have protected zones, for example, in the oceans, on land. Why do we do that? Because we've implicitly given a price to it, a high price. Do not touch it. If you're in traditional societies, very often bits and pieces of nature, and I use the term not brittle, I'm using the term intentionally in economic terms, are regarded as sacred. Well, that's giving a huge value to that object. And preserving it is the equivalent of investing in it. Because if you don't preserve it, of course, it gets destroyed. So there are many ways of going about it. The one really good news, I think, in the post-COVID period is the fact that, as I say, the nurturing part of nature requires labor. It doesn't require machinery. It doesn't require chainsaws, just the reverse. You don't want to cut down the trees, you want to grow trees. So investment in nature is likely to be, and in fact, there's a deal of evidence, is labor intensive. And that's good news. It means the employment issue is not, there's not going to be a trade-off between employment and nature, investment in nature. I think there are other aspects of the problem we could discuss, but I think a combination of these aspects of accounting, behavior, cooperation is what is needed for us to move forward.
Thank you. I think, Partha, you've given a new meaning to the traditional phrase in asset management of passive investing, which I must say I find very attractive. Although when I think about my own garden and my own few trees, I have to be a bit more active than that. But I love the idea of letting them just grow, and I think the concept of passive investing applied to nature is absolutely excellent. Partha, I'm afraid our time is almost running up, but so I wanted to ask you just a word about the sense of urgency and how we instill that sense of urgency. We've had some fantastic media and film related. We've had David Attenborough's wonderful witness statement, on which you also appeared. And I think to me, COVID has been a stimulus to this discussion. It's been a stimulus to the idea that we aren't in the right place in many of the ways that we're living, what we're wearing, what we're eating, how we're behaving. What's your feeling about the urgency that's required here? And are you, in the very end, are you optimistic that we will come through and succeed in restoring nature to where it should be?
That's a hard one to answer. The first part is easy. Yes, there is enormous urgency. A state of the environment reports that have been compiled over the past 2 decades, starting with the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and more recently IPBES report on the state of the environment, they're very sobering reading. We have really trashed a good deal of Earth in the process of economic development as we have defined it in the past. So yes, there's no question about that. What can be done? Well, it really depends on us. We are not looking at a government problem. We're not looking at a problem of the market. We're looking at the fact that we, as citizens throughout the world, have been extremely negligent. Particularly, I can't speak for countries outside my own experience, but I do have data to show that what might be going through people's minds, which has resulted us into being here. The job is ours as citizens. The one great possibility that I see is the internet. We citizens we have access to people we have never met. So it's not just a question of going around within a neighborhood and complaining to the local authority. We can reach a much bigger audience. I think citizens, we need to think of ourselves as citizens when we think about nature. And as citizens, for collective security, we need to do something. And I would like that the review ends with a plea of 2 things. One, that the citizens ought to get together, directly and indirectly, to put pressure on all concerned, and including pressure on ourselves in our personal behavior. It's not just other people's problems. We ourselves are tarnished. We have to take selfie no matter where we go. We trash nature even as we do that. And the other thing we make a plea for in the review is education. We have to internalize our concerns because no institution can protect nature against the assault that we are capable of inflicting on it because of the 3 properties I mentioned. At the end of the day, we have to be judge and jury ourselves of our own behavior, not of others, obviously. And that can only happen, in my judgment, if you have some basic understanding of this infinitely beautiful object we call nature, the processes that are taking place. Absolutely mysterious and amazingly beautiful if you just try and understand it a little bit. You don't have to be a deep ecologist. And if we are educated in nature studies from the earliest of our years and it doesn't disappear, then there is a chance that we will come to have an affection for nature, let alone awe. And I think at the end of the day, that will be the force that will be required because institutions can't do it all on their own. We have to support the institutions by our own behavior.
Partha, Professor Partha Dasgupta, thank you very much indeed for those insights. I'm looking forward hugely to the response to the review, which will come out shortly. And I think that we are at the very beginning, I do believe we are at the beginning of a revolution in the way that we're thinking too about nature and how we use nature and how we value nature. And I'm convinced that the review that you have been responsible for will be a key part in that discussion. Thank you very much indeed for this, for your insights, and thank you very much indeed for this session at the Green.
Thank you very much, Roger. Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure, as always, to have a conversation with you.
Thank you.